Can you hear me, by the way? I'd particularly like to thank Imam Al-Masmari and the Muslim Unity Center for hosting us again, their hospitality. It's wonderful that they opened their house of worship to others of different faiths. If everybody did that, I think we'd have a different world. So before I introduce our speakers, I'd also like to thank the Rabbits Foundation for their support. We can't have this lecture series without them. I think this is our 5th year, and I'm just curious to know, among you out there, is this anybody's first time attending? Wow, that's great, because what we want to do is continue to build on this event, and I think you're going to be well rewarded. Our good friends, Howie and Saeed, are really indefatigable and quite knowledgeable and entertaining all at the same time. It's not an easy thing to do. And by the way, for those of you who were worried about our reputation for hazing first-timers, I want you to know that after the unfortunate hazing incident of 2017, we no longer engage in that practice. So with that, let me introduce our speakers tonight. Professor Howard Lupovitch received a PhD in Jewish history from Columbia University. He's taught at Cornell University, Colby College, the University of Western Ontario, and U of M, where he was also a fellow at the Franklin Institute for Advanced Jewish Studies. He currently is Associate Professor of History and the Director of the Cohen Haddow Center for Judaic Studies at Wayne State University. Professor Lupovitch has published 2 books and is completing The History of the Jews of Budapest and writing history on the Neolog movement. Professor Lupovitch is the 2009 winner of the Bernard L. Moss Prize for Achievement in Jewish Culture and Continuity in the Area of Humanities. So welcome, Howie. Thanks. And Saeed Khan, I'll introduce you guys both. I don't know who's going first. I know you guys, Howie's going to go. I'll introduce Saeed at the same time, and then you guys can all be done with me. Saeed Khan is currently in the Department of History and a lecturer in the Department of Near East and Asian Studies at Wayne State University, Detroit, where he teaches Islamic and Middle East history, Islamic civilizations, and history of Islamic political thought. Mr. Khan is also a research fellow at Wayne State University Center for the Study of Citizenship. He's also adjunct professor in Islamic Studies at the University of Detroit Mercy and at Rochester College, co-teaching a course on Muslim-Christian diversity. His areas of focus include U.S. policy, globalization, Middle East and Islamic studies, as well as genomics and bioethics. Mr. Khan has been a contributor to several media agencies such as C-SPAN, NPR, Voice of America, and the National Press Club, as well as newspapers and other outlets, and is also consulting on Islamic and Middle East affairs for the BBC and CBC. In fact, he travels more than any human being I've ever seen. I'm actually thinking there might be 3 of him, and he just hasn't told anybody. It's a great scam.
Yeah, because I'm a Trinitarian, right?
Yeah, you're a Trinitarian. Very good. Excellent. So please join me in welcoming Howard Lupovitch and Saeed Khan.
Good evening. Shalom Aleichem. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you, Imam, and everyone else, and the Muslim Unity Center for sponsoring us again. This is not my first time here. I think this is maybe my 3rd time speaking here. I think so. 4th time. 2nd. At least. I mean, what I mean to say is I've been here before is what I mean to say. And I have to tell you before I start, I've enjoyed these series so much. I mean, really for 2 reasons. The first is, well, I get a free tutorial from Saeed each time in some Islamic culture, history, theology, whatever it is. It's like I'm getting a free course here, or half of a free course. A free course. That's one reason. The other reason is every time we do this, I get to discover, as I'm sure many of us do, get to discover yet another way in which Judaism and Islam are parallel or similar of what they share in common. And that I think is really remarkable, and especially because growing up as a Jew in America, we would hear more about Judaism and Christianity. The Judeo-Christian tradition, the Judeo-Christian. It was always about Jews and Christians, and yes, Judaism and Christianity have things in common origin, but the more I learned about Islam, and this is no disrespect to my Christian friends and neighbors and colleagues, the more I realize that really, I mean, when the real similarities and parallels are between Judaism and Islam, and I'm expecting in this series to learn yet another similarity between the two in talking about Halacha, Jewish law, and Sharia law. So with that, let's dive in. Now, the series, we're not going to talk about the Halacha and Sharia law in its totality. We really want to focus on about how each has met the challenge / opportunity of adapting to life in America. So let me start by making a few general comments about Halacha, and then talking specifically about the experience of Halacha, the use of Halacha in a particularly, especially American context. I think the best place to begin is by defining the word Halacha, because in some ways, it's a little bit misleading. Now, in common usage, Halacha is the term used to denote Jewish law. But in point of fact, the word halacha does not mean law in Hebrew. There are other Hebrew words for law. There's chok, there's din, there's mishpat. Those are words for different kinds of law. Halacha, although it is the term for Jewish law, literally or etymologically, it comes from the Hebrew word lalechet, which means to go or to proceed. Or the Hebrew word lahalich, which means to guide or to lead. And so this isn't simply a semantic difference or a choice of words. I mention this because the fact that the word halacha is related to the word to go and to proceed reflects the very important fact about it, that halacha, Jewish law, is something dynamic and not static. It evolves, it develops, it adapts, it accommodates, and has been doing that for centuries. Now, as we'll see, it's going to be one of the things that's going to help Halacha adapt to the American context is the fact that it is something dynamic and not static. The second thing about Halacha, Jewish law, which really, if you think about it, might more accurately be defined as Jewish way of life, sort of the Jewish path, but we'll call it Jewish law for colloquial purposes, is that most Jewish law, halacha, developed, or it was developed by Jews originally and largely in the diaspora. It really came into being in the post-biblical Jewish world when Jews were living in other countries. First in Babylonia, which at the time was part of Persia, and then other centers of Jewish life. So, and while it did also develop in the land of Israel, even there, for most of the time where halacha has been in existence, it was something that was used by and something that guided Jews who were living as a minority in another country. It is a way of life, it is a set of laws and rules that was developed and is keenly attuned to be used by a group, a community in a diaspora context. It is designed for a diaspora experience. And this was one of the things that helped it develop. And as a way of life, as a set of laws in a diaspora experience, Halacha was able to do two things for Jews simultaneously. Now, these two things may seem contradictory, but they're not. On the one hand, over a period of time, over the period of several centuries, let's just say from the year 0 CE to about 1000 CE, roughly speaking, Halacha expanded and developed into a set of rules and laws and customs that guided every aspect of Jewish life. It was an all-encompassing set of guidelines. Not only guiding religious rituals like prayer and dietary laws and the Sabbath, Shabbat, and festivals, but everything Jews did, what Jews would wear, how a Jewish man would shave, he would wear his beard, the friends you would keep, how you would use your leisure, every aspect, it was all-encompassing. on the one hand. On the other hand, halacha was designed so as to make it possible for Jews, wherever they were living, to live with one foot in the world of Judaism, in the Jewish community, and one foot in a larger mainstream society and culture. Halacha rarely, if ever, demanded of Jews that you cease to have any connection with the world outside the Jewish community. On the contrary, an important element of halacha, and one of its oldest original elements, is an instruction to be part of the world beyond the Jewish community. And that's actually, as often is the case, halacha is rooted in the Hebrew Bible, and wherever there's a rule or a guideline, the most forceful are those that can be proven, that can be rooted in a particular biblical verse. And this notion of living both in and outside the Jewish community, this was something that was instructed to Jews at the beginning of the diaspora by none other than the biblical prophet Jeremiah. In Jeremiah 29, chapter 29, I would say one of the most underrated chapters in the Hebrew Bible, because it really defined the concept of the diaspora. Jeremiah says, he's speaking in I suppose it's kind of like an open letter to the Jews who have recently been exiled from Jerusalem. And he says to them, among other things, he says, seek the welfare of the city into which you have been exiled. Pray to God on its behalf. For in the welfare of the city in which you are living, you will find peace. This is an instruction to Jews at the very outset of diaspora Judaism, not only to be good Jews, but to be good citizens. A real sense of civic obligation, of living outside the Jewish community as well. Now that, as we will see, that's going to make it easier for Judaism and halacha to adapt and to be adapted to a whole variety of circumstances. Wherever Jews would go, first of all, halacha as a set of rules was portable and could go with them. But insofar as it was adaptable, it could be adapted to any circumstance. And Jews lived in many different places as a minority. The very fact that halacha as a system worked where Jews were a minority in a Christian country or a Muslim country, equally effectively where the situation for Jews was difficult or the situation for Jews was more amenable, that attests to the fluidity of halacha. Now, that's really the gist of halacha until about 200 years ago, before Jews started, coming to America, entering the modern world. But I would just generalize and say that halacha, in addition to be dynamic, it also allowed for a healthy balance between uniformity and diversity in Judaism. And there are big things that all Jews would agree on. You know, the Sabbath is on the same day. There was this Jewish calendar. All Jews have a Seder on the same night, all over the world. Holidays. Eventually, the prayer service became regularized. For centuries, it was possible for a Jew living anywhere in the world to visit a synagogue anywhere else in the world and feel comfortable to pray there. And maybe even lead the service, if not at least participate, but also feel like he or she had fulfilled the obligation to pray. That's uniformity, but it also allowed a sense of diversity. Within this system of halacha, Jews agreed on the big things, but they could disagree seamlessly, often without conflict, often without problem, about the little things. I'll give you one example. To this day, when it comes to the dietary restrictions on Passover, there are Jews who will not eat legumes on Passover, myself included. I'm Ashkenazi, that's one kind of Jew. But there are also Jews who not only eat legumes on Passover, called kitniot, but they do it insistently. It is one of the delicacies they enjoy on Passover. And And that difference existed side by side in the Jewish world for centuries without conflict, without any problem. Maybe an occasional conversation. That's a healthy balance between uniformity and diversity. Now, the other signature feature of Halacha in the pre-modern world was that it stemmed from the status of the Jewish community as a minority community in the pre-modern world. And that status was defined, among other things, by the Jewish community being defined legally and politically as an autonomous corporate entity. The Jewish community was semi-independent, which in principle meant that Jews, wherever they lived, were given the privilege of living as a community according to Jewish law, self-government. Now, it was never complete. Jews were still compelled to obey the law of the land. In fact, one of the core principles of Halacha, Dina di Malchuta Dina, the law of the land is the law. You have to follow the laws of the land, but Jews were allowed within their own community to live according to Jewish law, and the leaders of the Jewish community were empowered by the state to enforce Jewish law, meaning that until about 200 years ago, Jews, the observance of Halacha and affiliation with the Jewish community were not by choice, they were mandatory. Jewish communities had the right to enforce these laws in a real coercive way. And I'm not just talking about shame and guilt, making you feel bad. Let me give you an example of what I mean by a real coercive way. You know, there was a rabbi he was asked about 800 years ago, there was a small Jewish community, which today would be in Germany. It was a very small Jewish community that only had 10 men. And you need 10 men in those days for a prayer quorum. And the question came up, if you need 10 men, what if one of the men wanted to leave the community, go out of town, whatever? Would they be allowed to? And the answer was, the community had the right to say to an individual, you may not go on vacation, you may not go out of town unless you find your own substitute. Not, how can you leave us without a minion? Not just to make them feel bad, but in an authoritative, coercive way. That was the nature of Halacha. It had real authority. Now, in the last 200 years, long story short, in exchange for citizenship, first in Europe and America, and then eventually everywhere in the Jewish world, one of the things that Jews had to give up was the autonomous corporate nature of the Jewish community, and more broadly, in the age of the separation between religion and state, Halacha was no longer compulsory. Halacha became voluntary. In other words, Jews were no longer required to observe Jewish law or to belong to the Jewish community. They did so voluntarily. Now that is a seismic change. Now that didn't only happen in America, and that didn't begin in America, but what America really was in terms of Halacha is the place that epitomized that change. American society has been one of the most open and welcoming to Jews. Compared to anywhere Jews have lived. And this openness really magnified the voluntary nature of observing Halacha, observing Jewish law. And the sense of American individualism. America is by its very nature a voluntary society. Individual rights, the right of the individual to say yes, to say no, that runs directly contrary to a system of religious instructions being coercive and obligatory. And so, the challenge of religious leadership in America for Jews, the challenge of the leaders of the Jewish community, and particularly the rabbis, the religious leaders of the Jewish community, has been the challenge of religious leadership in the age of religious volunteerism. When you no longer have the ability to say to someone Jewish, you must, or you must not, how do you get them to do it or not to do it? That has been the singular challenge. And that has been the challenge in making Halacha a relevant and meaningful aspect of Jewish life in America. Now, in America, there hasn't been only one kind of Judaism. There have been several different kinds. There are let's just say for the purpose of this evening, there are four main denominations of Judaism in America. Each one dealt differently with the challenge of how do you get Jews to observe? Now the four, Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist Judaism. They come from the same matrix. One of the main differences between them is how they met the challenge of adapting halacha to a situation of religious volunteerism. And they did it differently. I would group them two and two. Let me say a word about Reform and Reconstructionism first, because they have less to do. They're the ones, we would call them non-halachic movements. They redefine themselves so as to embrace fully this notion of being Jewish as something voluntary. So if you are a Reformed Jew, the basic notion is whatever you want to do, great, but you don't have to do anything. It is by choice. Reconstructionist was a slight variation on that. Reconstructionists said, yes, it's voluntary, but let's try to adapt Jewish laws in such a way to make them more appealing, to get more Jews to do it. Okay? To lure Jews to choose to voluntarily choose to be more observant, to embrace halacha. So, but those are less relevant. The more relevant for us are Orthodox and Conservative. These are what we would call halachic movements, halachic denominations, movements which value not only the observance of commandments, but it's, to some degree or another, they value the authoritative nature of halacha, although they do it somewhat differently. Orthodox is the most straightforward proposition. Orthodoxy, in a situation of religious volunteerism, Orthodox Judaism redefined itself as a voluntary community in which everyone who belongs voluntarily chooses, that's a little redundant, voluntarily sees halacha as the same way it used to be. So that even though halacha has become something voluntary in the Orthodox world, those Jews who have joined an Orthodox community, an Orthodox synagogue, they have collectively agreed to see halacha as still obligatory. But they're no longer being told to do that. They have opted to do that. So think about it. I'll just give you an example. In the Orthodox world, it's not permissible to drive a car on Shabbat or on a holiday for a variety of reasons. It's not permissible. Now, if you are an Orthodox Jew and you do it, you're not going to be put in jail for it. You can't be jailed for that. That would violate the First Amendment. But the other members of your community will see this as something wrong. Now, the consequences there, they really transpire on two levels. There is the aforementioned guilt and shame, which, as we all know, can be very effective wherever they're coming from, especially, let's say, your parents or members of your family or your siblings or whatever. True story. But no less important, what this voluntary community called Orthodoxy figured out, beyond guilt and shame, which of course is very effective, is that when you join this community, being a member of an Orthodox community brings certain benefits. And if you want to make sure that the members of the community are fulfilling this obligation of embracing halacha as something mandatory, one of the things you can threaten, or one of the things you can do, is to withhold the benefits of membership. Now, these vary, but I'll give you an example. In the Orthodox world, as in much of the Jewish world, having an honor in the synagogue, being called to the Torah, being asked to lead the service, that is high status. And what an Orthodox community can do, if there is someone who is, let's say, not properly observing something or another, flouting halacha, they can simply say, you will not be honored in the synagogue at all. That's withdrawing a benefit of membership. The community can do it. It's one of the rules they live by. But what I would emphasize is that's a different way of enforcing halacha That's a way of enforcing it that is more in sync with or in tune to the fact that in America, the Jewish community does not have the same kind of coercive authority that it once did, for better or for worse. Now, for conservative Jews, there's a little bit of twist. There's a little twist here. Now, in pure sociological terms, conservative Jews tend to be less religiously observant on the whole, certainly not in every case. But the big difference between conservative and Orthodox in terms of halacha stems from, to what extent can Jewish law change and adapt? That's first. And secondly, what is the mechanism or the rationale through which Jewish law can change or adapt? Now, in an Orthodox world, and here I'm generalizing, there are degrees of Orthodoxy, there are different kinds, but I'm going to, for the sake of time, I'm just going to make one blanket statement about Orthodoxy, which is more or less accurate. The basic principle of Orthodoxy is that change in Judaism is minimal, if not non-existent. The mantra of Orthodoxy has been, Kol davar chadash, asur me'hatorahi. That which is new is forbidden by the Torah. Now, leave aside that the idea of that which is new is forbidden by the Torah is a relatively new idea, and that's the paradox in which Orthodox Judaism is founded. But that's another story. So there is a real reluctance to change anything. And secondly, if something is going to be changed, the only way change can be justified, a change in halacha can be justified, is if it's justified within the pre-existing corpus of halachic precedent. You have to find a rationale within earlier existing halachic decisions. That's the only way it can change. Now, conservative Judaism embraces most of that. The one twist is, in addition to using halachic precedent or halakha as the only rationale for change, in addition to that, conservative Jews will also use what we might say sociological factors. They'll ask the question, is this particular halakha, not only is it relevant, that's not exactly the question. The question I'd like to ask is, if the decision of regarding a particular law was made now, with those who made the decision back then, would they still make it the same way? Would the original rationale be applied now? Let me give you a couple specific examples, and then I can wind this up. I'll give you a couple of examples. I'll give you a less profound, let's call it a more minor example, although it has large ramifications. Then I'll give you a bigger example. The smaller example is this. The aforementioned, can you ride in a car on Shabbat or on a festival? Now, it's complicated, first of all, because the older law codes, let's say the rabbis of the Talmud, 1,500 years ago, they had never seen a motorized vehicle in their life. They had never seen a machine. They'd never seen an electric, a mechanized device. But the decision was made by halachic decisors when the automobile first appeared, that the difference between an automobile, let's say a carriage, is that when you start an automobile, you create a spark, and creating a fire is one of the prohibited forms of work on the Sabbath. So because of that, no driving in a car. And that's why Orthodox Jews will not ride in a car. It's one of the reasons, it's the main reason. For our purposes here, it's the most important reason. Now, what conservative Jews said along this, they said, true, that's all true, but they also noted a problem, and here's where they moved from the halachic, from the strictly legal, to the realm of the sociological. Conservative Jews in America in the 1950s, they made the following observation. They said that, look, in an era of suburbanization, most Jews no longer live close enough to a synagogue to walk. The only way Jews are going to be able to get to a synagogue on Saturday morning or Friday night and pray with the community is to ride in a car. And so using that as an impetus, they made an exception to the no driving on Shabbat rule. They say you can't drive on Shabbat except you can drive to synagogue. They made an exception. There's a certain malleability there. Now, you might think that was a radical departure. In fact, that decision was based on a particular interpretation of a particular halachic precedent. You see, about 1,000 years ago, maybe a little bit more, there was a rabbi whose name was Rabbeinu Gershon, one of the original Ashkenazic rabbis. And in his statutes, guiding the process of how the community makes halachic decisions, he made this statement which has been sort of the working guide for centuries of halachic decision makers. He said, all decisions should be made in accordance with three things: Re'ut Tovei Ha'ir, the outlook of the community elders; Minhag Kadmonim, the communities of old; and Tzorach Sha'ah, the needs of the present, the needs of the moment. You combine those things. So the decision to allow driving was seen as a combination of a balance between the customs of old and the needs of the day, which demanded, or which really pressured the Jews to be allowed to drive, lest they not be able to go to synagogue. And it was made by those with the most experience and knowledge and wisdom in terms of halachic decision making. More profoundly, I think, and perhaps most challenging in terms of adapting halacha to America, are those situations when halachic precedent diverges the most blatantly from, let's say, modern sensibility and modern culture. And I think nowhere is this more prominent or obvious than with regard to the status of women in Judaism according to halacha. Because one of the things which is characteristic of the halacha for centuries is, in the same way that the Jewish community was a largely patriarchal Jewish community, halacha is a largely patriarchal set of laws and rules. Now, there's a clear division within halacha, a division of responsibilities where the home is the realm of the mother, and things public, the community, is the realm of the man, of the father. For this reason, one of the things that women were not allowed to do, according to halacha, was they were allowed to go to the synagogue, and they were encouraged to go to the synagogue, and they would sit separately in the synagogue, but they weren't allowed to have an honor, a public honor in the synagogue. A woman was not allowed to be called up to the Torah, to read from the Torah, to lead the service, to be counted in the prayer quorum, and above all, a woman was not allowed to be a rabbi. Now, there were reasons for all of this, but the main reason cited in halacha was a concept called kvod hatzibur, the dignity of the congregation. It would be undignified for a woman to be called up to the Torah. Maybe partly because of the optics, partly because it would take that privilege away from a man, something like that. Now, that was the baseline. Where this became problematic in America, or when this became problematic in America, is when, in American society, there was greater egalitarianism, or equality of status between women and men. And think about it. There was a point where, and this hasn't been true for that long in America, let's say for the last 50 or 60 years, there were Jewish women, let's say observant Jewish women, who might run their own business. They might be the president of an organization. They might hold public office. In other words, in the mainstream world, they are not only high status, they could have top status. But when they walked into a synagogue, and particularly when they walked into an Orthodox synagogue, they were immediately transformed into second-class citizens. And the odd thing was, the women themselves, in some cases, would see no contradiction between that. It was an odd situation. Now, in the Orthodox community, until very recently, there was a simple dichotomy. It was just a division of status. What I just described to you was simply, this is what it is, and this is how we're going to do it, and if it seems contradictory, if it seems at odds, doesn't matter. This is what we're doing. And still, in many Orthodox congregations today, that is still the case. Whatever a woman does outside the synagogue in the rest of her life, when she walks into that synagogue, she is going to be denied the basic status, the basic honors of being in the synagogue. Now, that was in Orthodox. In conservative synagogues, probably for the last 40 or 50 years, they began to rethink this whole question. And the main approach to rethinking the status of women that having this role in the service is rethinking that principle, kavod hatzibur, the dignity of the congregation, and asking the question, okay, that concept was laid down as the guiding rule behind excluding women from the service hundreds of years ago, 500 years ago, because at the time, and this is conservative Judaism thinking, let's say sociologically or historically, at the time it probably was true. 500 years ago, it probably did seem odd in the Jewish community for a woman to have a position of prominence. But then they asked the question, is it undignified today in the 20th century or in the 21st century for a woman to have a public position? And they used as the basis, outside the synagogue, women have public positions all the time. So if that's true, why would it still seem undignified in the synagogue for a woman to have a public position? Now, this is the main reason why conservative synagogues have become egalitarian. They've basically given more or less an equal role to women, because the rationale is not an abandonment of halacha, but actually embracing the notion that halacha, in its very core, adapts. And the notion is failure to adapt means actually you're diverging from that older principle of halacha itself being dynamic and adaptive. Now, not everyone agrees, but I just described to you the two examples I just gave, whether or not you can ride in a car on Shabbat, and whether or not a woman can fully participate in the synagogue service. These are probably the two issues which divide conservative congregations from Orthodox congregations. I'm trying to think, are there any other issues which are, just singularly distinguish one from the other? I'm not sure. I'm not sure. In fact, these days especially, the single choice of whether or not you ride in a car on Shabbat, it really has become the distinguishing mark as to whether or not you're an Orthodox Jew. So what we have is, by now, we have this notion that we have these two conceptions of halacha. We have halacha as something, as the embrace of a system that's been around, which needs to be preserved and not change. We also have the embrace of halacha as a system which is dynamic and needs to continue to be dynamic. So this in a nutshell, these are the challenges that halacha has faced when coming to America. Facing the volunteerism of America, those who embrace halacha, those who live by it, have had to figure out what it means to live in America with one foot in the world of halacha and the other in mainstream American society. Thank you.
Thank you, Howard. Very nice and informative lecture. Logistically, I have to run this by Imam al-Masmari. Unity Center will have a prayer in about 15 minutes, so we would love to enjoy Professor Saeed's lecture, but then we will break for prayer after, then we'll have question and answers after. Is that okay? To delay the question and answer, so we allow our brothers in the Unity Center to do their prayers, and we will have snacks and socialize here. Professor Saeed.
Shalom Aleichem, Salam Alaikum, welcome all. Wow, I didn't realize that the one thing that bound Muslims and Jews was shame and guilt. But I'm starting to see the wisdom in that already. And yeah, you don't go after mom, for sure. I'd like to thank JCRC, AJC, MMCC, and certainly the Rabbits Foundation for their wonderful support, as well as your support, and welcome those of you who have now become seasoned and somewhat crusty veterans, and those of you who are first-timers now that you're immune from the hazing process that only a non-alcoholic hazing process can bring you. I last week was coming back from, or I was in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. I was invited by the Ministry of Culture to tour the coffee farms of Jazan. And that's not code and CIA talk, that was really looking at the farms down there. And on the flight over on Saudia, for those of you who haven't flown Saudia, which I suspect is many of you, the back 4 rows of the economy class are actually taken out, and they have a prayer area that is designated there, and they in fact have a digital compass, so no matter which direction you are flying, and depending on the acrobatics and the aerobatics of the pilot, you can always find out which direction is Mecca. And as it was an evening flight, a bunch of people just walked to the back and they performed a congregational prayer. And given the fact that only 5 people could fit into that area, we had 4 congregational prayers, one after the other. But what Howie was describing as the unity and the uniformity of this act was rather profound, and it was rather heartwarming. And at the same time, there were plenty of people on the flight who weren't praying. There was no religious police, i.e. flight attendants, that were telling people that you've got to get back there and pray. And in many ways, this is exactly to parallel the example of Halacha. What we find then is at the essence of Islam, its relationship to law, and particularly as we're going to talk about in the next, 3 lectures, how Islam negotiates law, particularly here in the United States. Dynamic is a wonderful word, because in many ways you have a 14 centuries old tradition that has been developing, evolving, certainly with a certain amount of trial and error, formulating a system which then in some ways binds 1.8 billion people on Earth, creates then a precedent where you have a tradition that is formed for people to then claim a continuity and a connection to those in the past when it comes to either their ancestors or people that they have never even encountered by themselves. And like Halacha, the Islamic law is also all-encompassing. Now, let me go ahead, and I'm sure some of you are noticing, I am not using the word Sharia. That is not because I am scared of using the word, but because Sharia is an imprecise word, like when we talk about Halacha, of really describing law. Like Halacha, and this is, we're always trying to find something. Halacha comes from the Hebrew meaning to go or to proceed. The word water. So this notion of dynamism, this also then embedded, negotiated, is the concept of accommodation. And when we talk about the United States, and particularly we're talking about the First Amendment, whether it's the Establishment Clause or whether it's the Free Exercise Clause, the notion of religious accommodation becomes paramount to understand. Not only what will the United States and the Constitution accept and accommodate when it comes to law of other religious traditions, what will those religious traditions accommodate when it comes to the broader legal edifice of the United States. And to take a look at religious accommodation before we even delve into Islam in America, I think it's important to see examples which I'll be the first to admit, unfortunately are underappreciated within the Islamic context for their historical provenance and line of understanding accommodation from within the Islamic tradition. When the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, arrives in Medina, and when he is conferred with the honor of the authority over the city of Medina, we have to remember that he comes in with his small group of followers as refugees, ones who are escaping the persecution, the ban, and the boycott that they had faced by the Meccans for the past 3 years. And we come to Medina in the year 622, or what becomes the first year of the Islamic calendar. One of the very first acts that the Prophet then enacts is the Constitution of Medina. And why this was critical was because it was perhaps the greatest example of social engineering by a minority group within a new paradigm. And so what we have then is the two major demographic groups that already existed in Medina. One was the locals of Medina, the Ansar, who were pagans. And then we had Jewish tribes who lived within the metropolitan Medina area, if you will. And now we have this new group of migrants who happen to be Muslim. And in a rather succinct 48 provisions, we then find the elegance of a Constitution of Medina which then accommodates for all without causing anyone to sacrifice either their religious beliefs or perhaps equally importantly, their religious identity. Jews remain Jews, pagans remain pagans, the Muslims have a space for themselves. And the Islamization of Medina happens piecemeal over the next 10 years of the Prophet's ministry and happens voluntarily. So this idea then of what is the space for religious accommodation when Islam is an authority was established from the very inception of Islam when it creates its first Muslim state. But that doesn't end there. While this is some engineering that the Prophet does for Medina itself, he also embarks on a rather ambitious project of galvanizing the Arabian Peninsula. And this is then achieved through a set of accords and treaties and agreements with various tribes in various parts of the Arabian Peninsula. And we find that there is simply no monolithic template for this. A lot of it happens to be geographically based. Those tribes which happen to be along the western coast of the Arabian Peninsula in the province of the Hijaz, that which houses the two holy cities of Mecca and Medina, they are the first to be really fully on board. They accept both the religious authority of Medina, and they also represent respect and acknowledge the commercial authority of Medina in the sense of paying taxes and tribute. As you move farther away, you find that the relationships start to change. In the center of the Arabian Peninsula, you have the provinces of the Najd, which is where the capital of modern Saudi Arabia is, in Riyadh, and Tamim. And here you find that there are differences. Some tribes will accept just authority but not pay taxes. Some will pay taxes but accept the religious authority. And then the farther you move to the east along the Persian Gulf, the Banu Hanifa in the area of Yamama, they actually do not accept the Prophet as being a religious authority. Why not? Because they had a moment. And the Prophet, meaning Prophet Muhammad, is okay with this. For him, it was more important for there to be accords with the various tribes so that there is peace between Medina and these other tribes. Now that kind of an architecture shows then an example of religious accommodation. Of course, this changes after the time of the Prophet because a certain standardization was critical to occur when there were two big empires to the north of the Arabian Peninsula. In the northwest, the Byzantine Empire; in the northeast, the Persian Empire, in order for exploitation to not occur with fractious relationships, particularly at a time when many of these tribes were saying, well, all bets are off, the Prophet is dead, so these agreements no longer are valid. By 634, there is now a consolidation of the Arabian Peninsula where both the religious authority and the commercial authority of Medina has now become codified. But it's important to recognize at a time when Islam is still in its embryonic stage, the notion of religious accommodation was still very critical to then go ahead and be negotiated, to be navigated, and to be codified. Would that was a little bit more part of the historical analysis that is given when it comes to how law is then negotiated. Now, moving forward, when we take a look at how Islam and Islamic law develops, we have a rather sophisticated understanding of this, and I won't bore you with too many details regarding an entire corpus and jurisprudence science of the law. But suffice it to say that it develops in some ways as need expects it to be. And this is, as you have said, when it comes to Halacha developing in the diaspora, it is oftentimes done so in response to what our specific community needs. Now, in the case of Islam, of course, we find that the law develops not as a diasporic imperative, but one where the political apparatus, the judicial apparatus of state is there to support the organic development of law. Something which, of course, was not possible when it came to the majority of Halacha because the sovereign nature of the state did not exist in it. So in some ways, we find then that Halacha and the development of Islamic law are, by definition, going to diverge in how the evolution occurs. Now, Conversely, we find, particularly since the advent of colonialism, that as there has either been a rupture to the sovereign state within Islamic states, or, to put it another way, with the kind of encroachment of other competing and sometimes clashing legal systems, it has caused an awful lot of tumult for the otherwise organic development of Islamic law. So when we take a look around the Muslim world and we see legal systems which don't seem to be functioning that well, part of it is to understand that are these legal systems operating on their own accord? Are they developing organically? Or have they been infiltrated by things like, say, the Swiss Code, the French Napoleonic Code, or the Italian Code? The legacy of colonialism has certainly then permeated many of the Muslim states and has had an indelible impact on legal systems there. And so now, legal systems are having to contend with is, do you go back to some system reset from the past, and does the socio-political architecture of that time still hold true today? Or do you try to tweeze out what is part of the legal system now and move forward? And this is a huge debate that is happening in the so-called Muslim world today. But as we are concerned here with America, and what does it mean for Muslims to then practice Islam here, what is permissible and what will they also tolerate? It's perhaps important to take a look at what we mean by religious accommodation. Now here's a bit of a controversial statement, and I will use the word Sharia. Dirty little secret is that America is essentially 99% Sharia. Now, before you go out there and say, wow, he actually said that, and now come the memes, what we mean by that is that the American legal system is broad enough to then accommodate for Islamic law to essentially be practiced, and put another way, that there is a high level of compatibility between Islamic law and the American legal system. Okay? And this really shouldn't come as much of a surprise, because you really don't see Muslims operating in a parallel universe, or by and large, one's going to find that Muslims are able to secure and practice their form of Islam in a conventional way, very much under the auspices of the American Constitution and all other laws that are derived from that. So then what becomes the anomaly? What becomes then the controversy? Well, the religious scholar Paul Tillich said that culture is the vessel in which religion resides. And what we find then is not a debate about whether Islamic law is somehow or the other practicable within the United States, but is it culturally acceptable within the United States? And when we take a look at the long arc of various religious traditions and their ability to navigate the American civil landscape, almost entirely it comes down to the issue of culture. And we'll go ahead and talk about some of these various groups and how they have had to navigate it sometimes rather painfully, but as a Muslim, certainly saying this with full gratitude, because in many ways they certainly blazed the trail for Muslims then to be able to practice Islam in America. Of course, we go back to antebellum America. In fact, we go back to pre-revolutionary America, and here, of course, we're talking about the American slave history. Estimates place at least 1/3, and the process of the erasure of Muslim identity is a dark period in American history, and I think it's certainly interesting that this happens to be, of course, black. Are we breaking? Yep. Okay, we will return.
5 minutes break. Please help yourself to start.
Thank you.
Okay.
if anyone's here. So, nice event, good conversation, good experts on culture and religion from the local university, heads of the Judaic and Islamic departments for a 3-week event. First one at a mosque, second at a synagogue, third at the Wayne State University. So we're taking a break for the Islamic prayers, so I might join them or snacks and back. So hopefully I'll pop back on for the conclusion of Professor Saeed's talk and Q&A.